Hi, I just wanted to share with you something that I came across in my own time of devotion yesterday. I am going through 2 Corinthians right now, and 2 Corinthians is probably one of my most favorite books of the Bible. And sometimes I'll say that to people and they'll look at me like, okay, and kind of like, well, why? And as I go through this book again and again and again, I realize that it helps keep my perspective right. We live in this world and it's so easy to just kind of go along with the ways of this world and have like a worldly mindset about things. And I feel like 2 Corinthians brings my perspective in line with the Word of God. It reminds me that I'm just passing through. It reminds me that the things that I'm going to face here are working for me for eternity. And so it gives me a biblical perspective. It gives me an eternal perspective. And I must need that because I'm really attracted to this book. And so I was in it yesterday. And I was in chapter 4, and Paul is writing this letter to the Corinthian church. And he says something interesting when you get to verse 17. He says this. He says, "For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory." And so Paul, we know he has endured unbearable sufferings and persecutions. You can go ahead to chapter 11 in 2 Corinthians, and in verse 23 through 33, there's like a list of it. It lists pretty much everything that Paul has endured. He's endured beatings and prisons and stonings and shipwrecks and perils and sleepless nights, and it goes on and on. And so there's been a litany of suffering that Paul has endured. And yet, here in verse 17, he says, "For our light affliction." Now, as I read that, I'm thinking, there's nothing light about what Paul has endured. But I think it's important that we understand that he's not overlooking his sufferings. He's not oversimplifying his sufferings. He's comparing them. And that's really important because when we compare, we can kind of get perspective. In fact, he says in Romans 8:18, he says this, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us." So he wasn't saying that these sufferings weren't bad. He wasn't saying that they weren't intolerable. He wasn't saying any of those things. He was saying in comparison to what is to come, light affliction. In comparison to what God had in store for him to come, light affliction. And that word light affliction means this. It means a weightless trifle of pain. A weightless trifle of pain in comparison to what was to come, which was the weight of glory, which was eternal, forever and ever and ever glory. He's saying this suffering that I'm going through right now is but for a moment. And he's drawing another comparison, is but for a moment, but what is to come is eternal. And so he's bringing some perspective to the Corinthian church. He's bringing perspective to my life and to your life as we walk through these things, as these sufferings. And it's really important that we make that distinction. The sufferings we make for Christ, okay? The things that we do for Christ that brings persecution upon our lives. Not just the stupid decisions we make and having to pay the consequences of those decisions, but when we stand for truth, when we stand for the word, when we do what the Spirit of the living God is telling us to do, and then because of that, we suffer persecution or suffering of some sort. That's what we're talking about here. He's saying those things right there are working for you. In fact, he says that he actually takes it a little farther. I love it. He says, actually, this that I suffer now is working for me. It's working for me. It's like a divine compensation plan where the return in heaven will be 100-fold. That's what it talks about in Matthew. He said, all that I'm going through right now for the sake of Christ, for the sake of the gospel, is actually at work for me. And so let's get really practical here. I think of it in terms of like one of those old-fashioned balance scales. He's saying, okay, let's put that balance scale. And on this side of the scale, I'm going to put everything from 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23 to 33. I'm putting everything there. I'm putting the beatings and the imprisonment, the stoning, the shipwrecks, the perils, the sleepless nights. I'm putting all that on one side of the scale. And on the other side of the scale, eternal weight of glory. And he says there's no comparison. No comparison. For Paul, the future glory that he would experience with the Lord for eternity far outweighed any suffering that he could experience in this world. In fact, he might go as far to say, the greater the sufferings for Christ on earth, the greater the glory in heaven. And so I just want to share that with you today because I think we all need perspective. There are times where we need our perspective to be brought in line with the Word of God. And if you are going through something right now, you are suffering persecution, rejection, whatever it is, for the sake of Christ, know that there waits for you in heaven an eternal, not just this little momentary affliction, eternal weight of glory. God bless you and be encouraged.